very strange because I'd never ever done a performance by myself. I'd only ever played in Procol, Harum and things like that. I'd never actually done a Matthew Fisher show before.
The sound begins like a misty trance, low, sustained, and tender like an echo from an ancient cathedral. It's not a blazing guitar riff or a soaring vocal scream, but a quiet, mournful organ line that slips into the listener's memory like an indelible whisper. We skipped the light fandango. At the heart of the iconic A Whiter Shade of Pale, the 1967 song that shook the world and became one of the greatest rock anthems of all time, is an organ part with shades of Bach, both classical and surreal. And the man behind that sound was Matthew Fisher, a quiet genius whose name the world has nearly forgotten. Unlike the rock stars of his era, Fisher didn't smash instruments, didn't spiral into excess, didn't demand the spotlight. He stepped back, letting the music lead, allowing his instrument to speak every word he never did. And yet, that very humility would become the core of a contradiction. The artist who gave soul to an immortal song but wasn't recognized as its co-creator, forced decades later to go to court to reclaim what should have been his from the start. So who was Matthew Fisher? Merely the organist, or the true spirit behind a secular hymn? A lost figure in the glitzy chaos of showbiz, or a man who chose his own path no matter how quiet it was? His life journey reads like a fragmented symphony, glorious yet shadowed by unrest, where silence often echoed louder than any standing ovation. And perhaps he himself is the answer to one of music's most haunting questions. Can talent truly be heard if it chooses not to scream? Early life. Matthew Charles Fisher was born on March 7, 1946 in Croydon, a suburb in South London. His childhood wasn't marked by tragedy or deprivation, but neither was it filled with stage lights or dazzling music lessons. His family was the picture of typical British middle-class life, with no one involved in the arts professionally. That made the musical path Fisher would later choose feel all the more solitary. From a young age, he displayed an unusual sensitivity to sound. While other boys his age were obsessed with football or comic books, Fisher was captivated by Johann Sebastian Bach. Classical music wasn't a common passion for a 10-year-old, but to Fisher, it was the only world where he truly felt he belonged. He began teaching himself piano, then organ, not through formal training, but simply by playing fugues and cantatas over and over until they became part of him. During his years at Allen's School, a prestigious secondary school in Dulwich, Fisher was not a standout student. Quiet and withdrawn, he had few friends and often retreated into his inner world, only truly alive when seated at a keyboard. Teachers described him as intelligent but elusive, disinterested in subjects outside music, and prone to isolating himself. He later enrolled at the Guildhall School of Music, one of London's most esteemed conservatories, hoping to pursue a career in classical music. But those years brought a harsh realization. The academic music world, for all its precision, was cold, rigid, and left no room for the kind of emotional freedom he craved. Fisher eventually dropped out, quietly walking away from the institution, with his love for Bach still intact, but his faith in the classical world shaken. It was in that liminal space, between the purity of Bach and the raw explosion of rock and roll sweeping across Britain, that Fisher began searching for a new sound. Something both classical and modern, sacred and worldly, half cathedral, half pub. And he found it not in a textbook, but in the Hammond organ, the instrument that would go on to change his life forever. Early career. If music was Matthew Fisher's sanctuary, then the late 1960s were when the world came knocking and pulled him into the light, ready or not. After leaving Guildhall School of Music, Fisher began playing keyboards for small-time rock bands around London. He had brief stints with the Downliners sect, a local rhythm and blues outfit, then moved on to Peter J. and the Jaywalkers, where he first experienced the world of professional performance. Though none of these groups achieved major success, Fisher gradually developed his own distinctive style, using the Hammond organ not for bombast or spectacle, but as a storytelling instrument, imbued with somber classical emotion that contrasted sharply with the raw energy of rock music at the time. That very style caught the attention of Gary Brooker, who was forming a new band with the ambition to create something different. Brooker, a former member of the Paramounts, had teamed up with poet Keith Reid to craft songs with surreal, metaphorical lyrics. They were searching for a sound that combined classical depth with an uncanny, emotive pull, and when Fisher entered the picture, they knew they'd found the missing piece. In April 1967, Procol Harum was officially born, with its original lineup including Gary Brooker, vocals, piano, Matthew Fisher, organ, Robin Trower, guitar, B.J. Wilson, drums, Dave Knights, bass, and Keith Reid, lyrics. But even they had no idea that the debut single they were about to record, intended merely as an experiment, would become one of the most enduring songs of the 20th century. Fisher was responsible for arranging and performing the Hammond organ part on A Whiter Shade of Pale, a strange, slow, dreamlike composition that sounded like nothing else on the charts. Drawing inspiration from Bach, particularly Air on the G string and Sleepers Awake, Fisher crafted an organ melody that was ghostly and spellbinding, simultaneously ancient and modern, as if echoing from an abandoned chapel in the middle of a psychedelic haze. When the song was released in May 1967, no one was prepared for the impact it would make. A Whiter Shade of Pale instantly topped charts in the UK and US, sold over 10 million copies, and became a cultural landmark of the psychedelic rock era. But from that very moment, when Fisher's organ sound echoed from radios around the world, the seeds of injustice were quietly planted. His name was not credited as co-writer. To the world, Matthew Fisher was the guy who played the organ. But to those who truly understood the music, he was the song's soul, and his silence, as noble as it was, would not last forever. Career success. In the history of modern music, few debut recordings have reached the cultural weight of A Whiter Shade of Pale. And few artists like Matthew Fisher have hit such artistic heights on their very first major studio session, only to carry a quiet wound that would shadow their entire career. The success of Procol Harum after that first hit was undeniable. The band was immediately courted by the press, record labels, and a generation of youth intoxicated by countercultural sound. But Fisher, the man behind the haunting organ melody that defined the song's entire emotional tone, was not credited as a co-writer. Official authorship went solely to Gary Brooker, music, and Keith Reid, lyrics. Fisher did not protest publicly. As always, he chose silence. Between 1967 and 1969, Fisher remained with Procol Harum, contributing to several landmark albums including Shine On Brightly and A Salty Dog. He didn't just play organ, he also stepped into production roles, especially on A Salty Dog, 1969, where his musical touch brought a refined, cinematic texture. Yet internal tensions, a growing sense of marginalization, and a deepening disillusionment with the music industry gradually pulled him away. By late 1969, Fisher left Procol Harum, just 2 years after helping the band craft their most iconic work. When asked why, he gave a characteristically brief answer: "I needed space to be myself." But everyone understood. It was his way of speaking about a quiet but profound disappointment. A creator of something magnificent, treated as a background player. After leaving the band, Fisher began a quiet journey as a session musician, producer, and studio collaborator. He briefly joined the Spiders from Mars, David Bowie's backing band, but the tenure was short-lived. He also worked with Robin Trower, James Dewar, and released several solo albums, such as Journey's End, 1973, and Strange Days, 1981. Though musically rich, these efforts remained commercially overlooked. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Fisher lived between two worlds. One, the lingering memory of A Whiter Shade of Pale's glory. The other, the present reality of an independent artist largely forgotten by the press and general public. But he harbored no regret. Fame had never been his pursuit. He only wanted to make music on his own terms. It wasn't until the early 1990s that Fisher rejoined Procol Harum in a surprising reunion effort. The Prodigal Stranger, 1991, and the band's international tours marked the return of the classical sound that had once defined their identity. Though no longer at their peak, the reunion felt like a gesture of reconciliation, at least musically. But old wounds don't heal easily, and the next chapter in Fisher's story would no longer be written in music, but in law. Because after 3 decades of silence, Matthew Fisher finally decided to speak up, not on stage, but in court. Dispute and internal conflict. For nearly 4 decades, Matthew Fisher lived with a bitter paradox. He had created the most iconic musical element of A Whiter Shade of Pale, yet was never recognized as a co-writer. His name was absent from the record label, missing from copyright documents, and nowhere to be found in the royalties the song generated. It was a delicate kind of wound, not loud, not bleeding, but quietly persistent for almost half a lifetime. Through the 1970s to the 1990s, Fisher remained silent. Perhaps he still hoped for quiet acknowledgement. Perhaps he feared losing his friendship with Gary Brooker, frontman of Procol Harum and the officially credited composer. But time did not ease the injustice. On the contrary, as A Whiter Shade of Pale was increasingly hailed as a cultural treasure of Britain, as his organ line was studied in classical music texts and rock anthologies, as it played in weddings, funerals, films, and commercials. Fisher realized his silence was no longer humility. It was erasure. In 2005, after nearly 40 years of endurance, Fisher formally sued Gary Brooker and publisher Onward Music, seeking legal recognition as co-composer of A Whiter Shade of Pale. His argument was clear. The organ part wasn't just arrangement, it was a melodic theme in its own right, independently conceived and central to the song's identity. The lawsuit sent shockwaves through the music world. It wasn't merely a dispute between former bandmates. It raised a deeper question. What constitutes composition? If a musical part is written after the lyrics and core melody, yet becomes the soul of the song, does its creator have the right to authorship? It was a dilemma never fully adjudicated in British law before. In December 2006, the High Court of the UK ruled in Fisher's favor. He was declared a co-author of the music, with 40% ownership rights. However, the court also ruled that Fisher would not receive back royalties, as the statute of limitations had passed. Gary Brooker immediately appealed, arguing that the organ was merely accompaniment and that Fisher had agreed not to be credited back in 1967. The legal battle dragged on for another 2 years, escalating all the way to the House of Lords, then Britain's highest judicial authority. Finally, in July 2009, the House of Lords upheld the previous ruling. Matthew Fisher was legally a co-writer, though not entitled to retroactive compensation. He didn't win financially, but he won in principle and in history. Still, the victory came at a cost. Fisher's relationship with Brooker was permanently fractured. After their 2004 tour and the Wells on Fire album, Fisher left Procol Harum for good. There was no reunion, no farewell, no parting words. Silence returned, but this time it came from sorrow and rupture, not choice. Some said Fisher was too stubborn. Others hailed him as a symbol for countless artists whose contributions go unrecognized simply because they lack self-promotion. But however one views it, Matthew Fisher's lawsuit became a landmark in the music industry. cited in case law, textbooks, and global copyright debates. And the cruelest irony? As most of the world continues to hum that haunting organ line every time a whiter shade of pale plays, many still don't know the name of the man who wrote it. Personal life. If one were to name a rock artist who lived in complete contradiction to every definition of a rock star, Matthew Fisher would be at the top of the list. No scandals, no paparazzi, no high-profile romances, no bankruptcies or flamboyant comebacks. Fisher chose a life of detachment, quiet, and near invisibility. And perhaps that was his most profound act of defiance against the noisy entertainment world he once passed through. Throughout his career, Fisher rarely spoke about his personal life. There is no public information about a spouse or children, no journalistic exposés digging into past relationships, and no photos of him at public events with a partner. In the few times he appeared on television or podcasts, he always kept a cautious distance, giving short answers and often redirecting the conversation toward musical technique or technology rather than personal emotion. After his final departure from Procol Harum in 2004, Fisher enrolled in a computer programming course at the University of Cambridge, a surprising decision, but one that reflected his true nature: introspective, independent, and logically minded. To him, music was a system, and so was computing. From then on, he walked two parallel paths, one as an independent music producer, the other as a software and digital developer. He ran Old Barn Recording Studios, a small countryside studio in England, where he recorded, mixed, and produced music on his own terms. From there, he released several solo albums that, while never widely known, maintained a high level of creative integrity. His personal website, MatthewFisher.com, was coded and managed entirely by him. Written in a humble, down-to-earth tone where he shared demo tracks, unfinished memoirs, and reflections that never made it to the press. Fisher also immersed himself in audio technology, digital signal processing, and even developed software tools to assist with composition. He no longer performed, no longer took the stage, but music never left him. Some might say Fisher had retreated, but in truth, he simply chose the path most artists don't dare take, stepping away from the spotlight, but never extinguishing the fire. And for a man who once shook the world with a mournful organ line, perhaps that was enough. Legacy and influence. Not everyone may know the name Matthew Fisher, but the moment the opening notes of A Whiter Shade of Pale begin to play, millions around the world instantly recognize a feeling, a sensation suspended between dream and reality, between Bach and blues, between church candles and nightclub haze. And strangely enough, that feeling doesn't come from the lyrics or the guitar, but from the haunting sound of the Hammond organ that Fisher composed. His organ line transcended the boundaries of pop music. It became a blueprint for how classical elements could live within rock without losing their solemnity. Later musicians like Rick Wakeman, Yes, Tony Banks, Genesis, and Keith Emerson, ELP, were all, to varying degrees, influenced by the musical language Fisher pioneered, at once ancient and modern, mathematical and deeply emotional. Fisher wasn't just a pioneer in fusing Baroque with rock. He also became a symbol of something rarely discussed in the music industry: the forgotten rights of creative contributors. His 2005 to 2009 copyright lawsuit is now part of legal and media studies, a landmark case in protecting the rights of supporting artists, those who don't write the lyrics, don't sing the melody, but whose contributions shape the soul of a song. From an artistic perspective, Fisher stands as proof of what we might call silent creativity, those who don't shout, don't take center stage, yet craft something so powerful that the world has no choice but to stop and listen. From a legal and cultural standpoint, he forced the music industry to examine itself, that sometimes what resonates most fiercely comes not from the spotlight, but from behind the keyboard, behind the lights, from the name left off the record sleeve. For Matthew Fisher, legacy wasn't measured in album counts, medals, or award shows. His legacy was a brief, wordless stretch of organ music, one that made the world pause in awe. And through that enduring silence, he redefined what it means to be an artist, not through fame, but through sound. Life today. After all the spotlight and collisions, Matthew Fisher chose a path few rock musicians dare to follow, reclusive, quiet, and wholly loyal to his creative inner world. He no longer performs, no longer stands on stage with Procol Harum. Instead, he stepped back, not to leave music behind, but to live more fully within it. Fisher now resides in the English countryside, where he runs Old Barn Recording Studios, a small, rustic space tucked away from the chaos of the entertainment industry. There, he continues to compose, experiment with sound, arrange, and release his own recordings. No PR, no trend chasing, no streaming platforms. He simply shares what he loves through a self-designed website, MatthewFisher.com. What's remarkable is that, starting in 2024, Fisher began to re-emerge, gently but with intention. He announced an upcoming double album of demos and previously unreleased compositions, marking one of his first major personal music projects in years. On his website, he also revealed plans to share Chapter 1 of his memoir, chronicling the journey from a Bach-obsessed boy in Croydon to the musician behind one of the most enduring songs of the 20th century. Beyond music, Fisher unveiled a new passion, collecting vintage watches, especially rare Universal Genève models. In May 2025, he appeared in a feature interview with Hodinkey, a respected watch magazine, one of the few times he spoke publicly about life outside of music. In the interview, he spoke of watches the same way he once spoke of the organ. "I like things that are mechanical, but have a soul." Fisher continues to stay far from social media, public events, and even Procol Harum tribute shows. Yet to his loyal fan base, every update on his website feels like a private performance, quiet but deeply resonant. He may never return to the stage, but he has never stopped creating. And to Matthew Fisher, music isn't something that has to be shouted to be heard. Sometimes, a single sustained organ note in the night is enough to silence the world. And he's still there, like a note that never fades. Matthew Fisher never tried to become a legend. He never stood before crowds demanding recognition, never delivered grand artistic manifestos, and never clung to fading spotlight. He simply wrote music, played the organ, and quietly stepped away, as if the notes he left behind were enough to speak for him. And that's exactly why he stands apart. In an era where artists often have to shout to be heard, Fisher chose silence and let his music rise from it. He didn't need a dramatic biography, a scandal, or 10 hit albums. He needed only one melody, like the haunting Hammond organ of A Whiter Shade of Pale, to etch his name into humanity's musical memory. His legacy isn't easy to spot on charts or museum walls. It lives in the ache of a rainy afternoon when that melody plays, in the strange pull of an organ line that feels like falling into a blurry dream. It's a kind of music that transcends form and reaches into the emotional depths where words can't go. And what about you? When was the last time you heard A Whiter Shade of Pale? Have you ever thought of the man behind that sound? The one who didn't sing, didn't stand center stage, but was the very soul of that immortal song? If you have, leave a word. Because Matthew Fisher deserves to be remembered, not as a background player, but as the one who gave us the most beautiful echo ever written from silence.